and welcome back to the Holistic Trauma Healing Podcast. I am Lindsey Lockett, your host. You can find me on Instagram at I am Lindsey Lockett. And in today's episode, I am doing part 9 of my Nourish Your Nervous System series. So if you're brand new to this series, you're going to want to scroll all the way back down through my podcast on Spotify or Apple, or you're going to want to scroll down to YouTube and you're going to want to go to the episode that is called Nourish Your Nervous System, Everything is Connected. And that is where you can begin the Nourish Your Nervous System series. But if you're already caught up with all the other episodes, let's dive in today to the 9th episode of the Nourish Your Nervous System series. And in this episode, we are going to talk about relational nourishment because you are a relational creature. Just as much as you are a physical creature because you have a body, you are also a mental creature. The last episode was about mental nourishment. You're also an emotional creature, which we're going to talk about more in upcoming episodes. You are an ancestral creature. You would not exist without all of the thousands and thousands of generations that came before you to create who you are today. And you're a relational creature. And so we need to nourish and resource all of these different aspects of our being to be whole people and to live holistically and to live nourished. So let's dive into relational nourishment and how to nourish your relationships. So in case you didn't know, humans are mammals, newsflash, and we are relational creatures, right? Like humpback whales who live in pods, wolves who live in packs, cattle who live in herds. We are also herd or pack animals. Humans need each other to survive. Nobody is meant to live on a deserted island all by themselves. Nobody is actually meant to live by themselves off grid in a cabin in the woods and never talk to any other person. Like, that's not sustainable. I think one of the greatest modern day tragedies is the loss of real life trusted community. I know that real life trusted community has kind of been going by the wayside for generations, especially with the, invention of technology, the internet, families who live in more nuclear homes instead of intergenerational living, people who move away from their parents and their families and raise their kids elsewhere, people who are much more involved in online communities than they are in real life communities. We are spending more time on screens. We're gaming more. COVID definitely contributed to the loss of a lot of our relationships and community. And so one of the greatest modern day tragedies is that even in a bustling city, humans are often really isolated and alone and lonely. And finding and belonging in a community is not just nourishing to your nervous system, it is also necessary for your overall health. Without community, you are alone, vulnerable, isolated, cut off from emotional and relational intimacy. And in so many ways, modern technology has really hindered our ability to connect with each other. My clients often tell me how much they crave connection and belonging, but they fear being judged, so they resist putting themselves out into the world. It requires risking vulnerability to establish connections with people, like genuine, true connection, not surface level connection. It requires us to let our emotional protector guard down and to authentically show how we feel. And that can feel really scary. It makes sense why it feels scary to be vulnerable and let your guard down in community. Many of us have had experiences of being bullied. We have the painful experience of not feeling a sense of belonging in our families of origin. In the past 5 years, we've dealt with the rise of cancel culture on social media. It makes sense why we are so afraid to be seen for who we authentically are. It makes sense why we feel so afraid to be known for who we authentically are. And yet, any fears or judgments you have about finding and belonging in community do not negate the biological fact that you still need other people to survive. You cannot be a whole and complete person without relationships. Relational wounds often begin before birth. Many of us were born into families who were never going to be able to give us the nurturing, the love, and the sense of belonging that we truly needed. If our mothers were not able to attune to our physical and emotional needs, then the relational wounding was present before we even had words, before we were even capable of storing explicit memories. If that emotional disconnect continues, such as through childhood trauma or the death of a parent, emotional abandonment, then we're carrying around deep relational wounds that are not easily soothed. And I will totally admit, I did not feel safe in adult friendships until I was over 30 years old. I didn't grow up with a strong friend group. I'm not in any kind of meaningful contact with anyone that I went to high school with. My friend group in my 20s consisted of very conservative Christian homeschooling moms and women's Bible study groups. And authentic sharing apart from whatever God was doing in your life wasn't really welcomed. And certainly sharing fears or struggles wasn't welcomed except in the context of a prayer request. And it was often met with someone in spiritual authority telling you to, trust God, pray more, ask for forgiveness for your sins because the struggles could be God's punishment or a way that God is trying to teach you a lesson. In the church, discussing doubts, fears, and even trauma wasn't encouraged or accepted because the prevailing attitude was to rely on Bible verses about trusting God and forgiving people who hurt you. I do believe in forgiveness as a value. I think it is important to forgive people who hurt us, but I don't believe that we should bypass our own emotional experiences and the processing of those experiences and jump straight to forgiveness without being able to actually go through the process and then come to forgiveness naturally and sovereignly on our own. When you're in the church and the prevailing attitude is we don't talk about trauma, we rely on God, and we forgive the people who hurt us, then that omits the essential steps of grieving and expressing anger, which are so crucial in trauma healing work. So I definitely missed some developmental milestones when it came to emotional intelligence in my relationship, and that's not my fault. I missed those milestones because of a lack of modeling, a lack of attunement in my family of origin. It's not surprising now in my life that the growth of emotional intimacy in my relationships mirrors my personal journey of accepting and feeling my emotions without judgment and without trying to fix them. In the book, Complex PTSD by Pete Walker, which looks like this. This is like my Bible. This is my favorite trauma healing book. I will link to it in the show notes below. If you've never read this book, please, please, please read this book. I have got this book marked up so much, so many underlines, notes in the margin. I ask all my clients to read this. I love it. In this book, the author, Pete Walker, talks about what he calls the complex PTSD onion. And it's not that physical, sexual, and verbal abuse don't matter. They absolutely do. They absolutely cause trauma. They absolutely need to be addressed, processed, felt through, metabolized as experiences. However, physical, sexual, and verbal abuse are forms of abuse that are obvious. They are overt. The core of the complex PTSD onion is actually emotional abandonment. And it's more insidious because it hides in plain sight. It's very covert. On page 93 of Complex PTSD, Pete Walker says, growing up emotionally neglected is like nearly dying of thirst outside the fenced-off fountain of a parent's warmth and interest. Emotional neglect makes children feel worthless, unlovable, and excruciatingly empty. It leaves them with a hunger that gnaws deeply at the center of their being. Have you ever experienced that feeling? I have. It sucks. Earlier in the Nourish Your Nervous System series, I talked about how our nervous systems are like a radio antenna. Our nervous systems are like a radio antenna on a car that pick up on frequencies and energies. And if in childhood, your sensitive nervous system picked up on frequencies of punishment, parental shaming, a lack of attachment and co-regulation, and emotional abandonment, then these became the frequencies to which your nervous system calibrated. And with enough repetitions, these frequencies became normal and familiar to you. Birth to age 7 is a critical time for all kinds of development, physical, cognitive, emotional. If during this time, your nervous system was in a state of constant alarm due to emotional abandonment, a lack of attunement and co-regulation, and punishment from caregivers, then a sense of true relational and emotional safety was never established for you. And so your nervous system had to adapt to survive. A child's nervous system picks up on all these frequencies, very sensitive, and adapts in a desperate effort to obtain and maintain attachment to the parent. But these adaptations also create neuropathways in the child's brain that form adaptive survival behaviors that we are taught to refer to as our personality. Oh, that's just the way I am. That's just the way she is. Prolonged, repeated signals that force the body into unconscious survival patterns and adaptations are not your personality. They are stuck trauma responses. These adaptive survival patterns are thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors that as an adult, you cannot simply stop. You can't just wake up one day and decide, I'm going to stop drinking if you're an alcoholic. You don't just wake up one day and say, I'm going to stop people pleasing if you're a people pleaser. It's not that simple. Some of these adaptive survival patterns are things like hypervigilance, chaotic emotional outbursts, repression or suppression of anger or grief or other emotions, dissociating, numbing, addiction, catastrophizing, negative noticing, self-shaming, people-pleasing, perfectionism, fawning, and anxious, avoidant, or disorganized attachment. Children are not developmentally capable of having conscious awareness of their adaptive survival patterns. They're just not. These are primal instincts that come from the most primitive part of our brain, which is called the limbic system. When threats aren't interrupted and soothed with unconditional love, attunement, co-regulation, mindfulness, and emotional intelligence on behalf of the parent, that is the parent's responsibility, then the limbic brain and nervous system prevent normal, healthy emotional development. And as more research comes out about trauma, we are learning that a developed, emotionally healthy adult brain and nervous system, particularly in a child's mother, is the key to healthy emotional development of the child. So when we use terms like complex PTSD, that simply refers to a lack of healthy parental attunement, attachment, co-regulation, and emotional intelligence, and the many emotional, physical, and behavioral adaptive survival patterns that we adopt to make it through life. So let's move into talking about emotional intelligence and intimacy. I am once again going to quote from this book by Pete Walker, Complex PTSD, on pages 32 and 33. He says this: emotional intelligence is our ability to successfully recognize and manage our own feelings and to healthily respond to the feelings of others. I believe the quality of our emotional intelligence is reflected in the degree to which we accept all of our feelings without automatically dissociating from them or expressing them in a way that hurts ourselves or others. When we are emotionally intelligent, we also extend this acceptance to our intimates. Another way of saying this is that I have self-esteem to the degree that I keep my heart open to myself in all my emotional states. And I have intimacy when my friend and I offer this type of emotional acceptance to each other. It's really, really beautiful. If you've never actually had the embodied lived experience of showing up in a relationship completely open to whatever the other person is saying and creating this kind of intimacy and emotional acceptance, it's next level. It's next level. The further I go on my healing journey, I no longer find myself unconsciously resorting to a lot of my old adaptive patterns like people pleasing, needing to be constantly busy, keeping quiet, not speaking my truth, avoiding conflict, and being in a perfectionist state to stay safe and feel like I belong. I mean, not as often anymore. Like I still do those things sometimes, but naturally I have fewer relationships with whom I feel totally comfortable, safe, and free to be authentic. It's not actually comfortable, safe, and free to be authentic with everybody. It feels nourishing to me to be able to share my intimate thoughts and feelings without fear that I'm too much, too needy, too sensitive, or too inappropriate. It feels nourishing to be listened to and understood by people who also share their thoughts and feelings with me. I accept what I feel. I accept what my intimate friends feel. Our relationships are safe containers in which we can be messy, imperfect, authentic humans without fear, without editing ourselves, censoring ourselves, without judging each other, without avoiding difficult topics. I can't stand surface level conversations or surface level relationships anyway. They actually feel extremely unsafe to me, and I find myself like not knowing what to do or say. And so when I have relationships that are emotionally intelligent, I don't have to silence or censor myself. I don't have to wonder if I'm too much or too inappropriate or whatever. Then we don't have to stick to surface level conversation, and we can actually create more authenticity and intimacy between us. I can be nourished in these relationships even if we disagree. Most of my relationships and I, we have really similar values, but we don't believe the same thing about everything. But even if we disagree, there is still love, safety, and belonging, right? There's also a lot of shit happening in this world that we do not have control over. None of us had control over COVID mandates. None of us have control over political polarization or climate change or government corruption or the overculture of capitalism and patriarchy, institutionalized education and prison systems, wealth inequality. Like none of us have control over these things. There's so much shit happening that we have no control over. Which is why it's even more imperative that we nourish our nervous systems as best as we can. And that's why I'm doing this Nourish Your Nervous System series. That's also why I published my book, Nourish Your Nervous System. Building resilience in community is a very important way that we can take back the power that we do have, and we can take back some of the control that we do have. I would bet my house that the greatest source of your pain and wounding comes from relationships. We are hurt in relationships. It's not fair, but we also have to heal in relationship. And not having safe, reciprocal relationships and community is a major source of what I call lifestyle inflammation, and it creates relational malnourishment. Sure, self-work has its place. Absolutely. Invest in yourself, grow, heal, sit with yourself, sit with your feelings, feel your feelings. That's so important and necessary. Become aware of your adaptive survival patterns. Yes, absolutely. And also, healing is not a solo job. It does not happen in a vacuum. Relationships also bring awareness to our adaptations and coping mechanisms. And I promise you, there are significant adaptive survival responses that do not come out in our relationship with ourselves, but get poked in our relationship with other people. You could listen to all the relationship podcasts, read all the relationship books, hire coaches, take courses, do breath work, do self-work. But in the absence of a relationship, you will have no opportunities to work through some of your biggest triggers, especially those triggers that involve abandonment, being too much, not enough, feeling unworthy, being rejected, being betrayed, and avoidance of physical and emotional intimacy. You cannot cultivate that by yourself. You can't. A complaint that I get a lot from people is, but I don't know how to find my people. But I don't know how to find them. I don't know where to look. And that makes sense. When you've been hurt, abandoned, betrayed, criticized, and rejected in relationships, it makes sense why you would want to swear off any relationship that goes deeper than the surface. You learned anything deeper than this is literally not safe. But surface level relationships aren't nourishing. Not at all. If you want to find your people, and I promise you they exist, you're going to have to leave your comfort zone, and you're going to have to get off your fucking phone. You have to put yourself in spaces to engage with people. You have to risk rejection. It's a necessary risk. You have to invite, not always wait to be invited. And you have to take responsibility for creating containers for sharing space with others so that you can build these relationships. Maybe another objection is coming up. Yeah, but what if I keep getting rejected? Well, you keep trying. You keep trying. You notice the urge to close yourself off and protect, and you do the hard work of remaining open. The community that you need and desire doesn't magically drop into your lap. It is consciously created. It never, ever, ever happens by accident. And one of the best and honestly easiest but hardest ways to create and build community is to just do life together. And like, I hate saying the phrase, just do life together, because that's a phrase that I used to hear a lot in evangelical churches growing up. Whenever there was a focus on like life groups and small groups, it was all about like, we're just doing life together. But ironically, 10 years post-Christianity, I'm now using this phrase as a way of encouraging you to build intimate, emotionally safe relationships. Just do life together. Here's what I mean by this. Spend time in each other's homes. Share meals together. We have 2 families that we have a separate weekly family dinner with. We have a family dinner with one family on Monday. We have a family dinner with a different family on Friday. We stick to it. It's just part of our routine. It's built into our schedule. It's important for us to come together, to gather around a table and good food, eat and talk with each other. That's how we're doing life together, because everybody cooks and everybody eats. So why not do it together? We do chores together. All of my friends and I, we garden. We're really into plants. So we help each other in our gardens. We stack firewood together, right? We're already doing these things anyway. Why not invite people over and make it go faster and get to know each other and build relationships? Because I spend a lot of time with them, my close community knows pretty much everything about my childhood trauma, complex PTSD, my neurodivergence, and my abandonment wounding. Like, I've shared all of that with them very openly. We've communicated about each other's triggers and how to talk to each other to restore safety in the relationship. We have navigated and repaired conflict together. In fact, I don't consider anyone that I haven't had a conflict and repair with to be in my inner circle. Like, you're just not in my inner circle unless we've gone through that process together, because it's so easy to have a relationship with someone when there's no conflict. It's a lot harder to navigate through a conflict, to get to the other side of a conflict, to completely repair and to keep going with the relationship, right? It's a lot harder. I have discussed different communication methods with my friends on how we can best support each other in our relationships when one of us is struggling. I have found in my current community love and belonging far and above my family of origin. Now that I know what nourishing relationships feel like, I never want to return to surface level acquaintance kind of relationships or family relationships where it's not safe to communicate openly, to feel and show emotion, to go through the rupture and repair process, and to experience unconditional safety and belonging. Just not willing to do it. I never want to return to that shit. I have a lot of hot takes and opinions that I share online, but I have just as many hot takes and opinions that I will never share on the internet. And it's not that I'm ashamed of my views, but I would damn sure get canceled for some of my opinions. I also don't keep them to myself and censor myself. Instead, I share my opinions and beliefs and hot takes with my people. I share it with people who aren't going to shun me or shame me because I'm figuring out an issue, because I'm learning where I stand on something, because I'm figuring out what I believe about a challenging topic, because I changed my mind. While I was writing the Relational Nourishment chapter of my book, Nourish Your Nervous System, one of my online friends, Anya Kotz, who was the former host of the Millennials Guide to Saving the World podcast, shared a really important post on community and her stories. And I immediately screenshotted it and I sent her a message telling her that I was going to quote her in the book. And now I'm quoting her on this video and in this podcast. So here's what Anya said. And it's like, oh, chef's kiss. It's so good. She said, talking about community and actually practicing it and living it every day are 2 very different things. It's hilarious to me that community has become such a buzzword, this conceptual thing that people organize masterminds and online courses around. You cannot learn how to be in community without actually being in community. You don't learn how to do this by signing up for an online course or listening to a podcast. You don't learn by visiting a community for a month or 2 and then leaving. You learn by relinquishing your anonymity and subjecting yourself to the brutality of being seen. You learn by forcing yourself to be the bigger person and apologizing when you've acted out of integrity. You learn through commitment, cooperation, and coexistence with people you disagree with. You learn by facing painful, awkward conflict head on. You learn through humility, grace, and heartbreak. Don't get me wrong, I am by no means an expert, but the more time I spend in my community, the more I realize how absurd it is that we think we can learn anything without actually doing it and practicing it. This shit is no joke. It's way easier to live in a place where people don't know you and where you can just walk away from people and situations that make you uncomfortable. It's way easier to live without being surrounded by so many mirrors. This community thing is by far the most challenging thing I've ever done, but I'm so grateful and relieved to be doing my best to walk the talk. Life is way too short to avoid all that can be learned here. Community and tribe are such profound teachers. Oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. I could reread that whole thing and this episode would be complete. It's just so good. I could not agree more. Authentic, conscious communication and relating is missing from the internet and many of our in-person relationships. I don't even know where to begin fostering online spaces where authentic, conscious communication is present, but I know how to create it in real life relationships. And we create it through authentic, conscious communication. If a relationship lacks intimacy and safety, there is probably a lack of authentic, conscious communication. So what do I mean by conscious communication? When you are aware of your own body and what you're feeling and sensing, you are present with yourself. And yet, you also know that you are not the center of the universe. You can be aware of others too, right? You can be aware of yourself and of other people at the same time. If you understand a particular trigger or adaptive survival pattern in yourself, and you can communicate that with others, you help bring awareness into that relationship. You are sharing something vulnerable about yourself that they did not know because you have communicated about it, because you have awareness of it. When you can acknowledge your imperfections and what you want to work on in yourself, when both parties in the relationship are able and willing to do this together, this creates a conscious relationship. You are each aware of your own ego, patterns, trauma responses, and more. Neither of you has to be perfect at communication or recognizing your ego in every moment to have a conscious relationship. This is where conscious communication is your friend. Conscious communication is mutually respectful. You can admit when you've reacted instead of responded. You can admit when you've believed the voice in your head without noticing it and challenging it first. You can apologize and take responsibility for your part in ruptures without collapsing into self-shame. And when the other person reciprocates this, you don't shame or blame them either. A conscious communicator also asks curious questions. When another person says something and you don't understand, rather than reacting or going off into your own la-la land of projections and assumptions and critiques, you can slow down. You can ask for clarification. Instead of getting immediately triggered and dysregulated, you can be curious. You can share your feelings and what's coming up for you without disregarding or dismissing the other person and their feelings. Your questions may even support the other person in having more awareness of their own feelings, needs, boundaries, and more. A conscious communicator also gives the other person space to share their perspective. And a conscious communicator can hold more than one perspective. If you're not able to hold more than one perspective in your interactions with your relationships, your nervous system needs some work. It's probably easier for me to provide you with examples, like real life examples of actual conscious communication, rather than trying to give you some sort of list of what conscious communication is or isn't. So here's an example of what conscious communication could look like. So let's say you have a pattern of people pleasing in your relationships and you don't stick to your boundaries and you're trying to repattern this. It's going to take time and it's going to take repetition, right? You don't just get up one morning and say, okay, I'm not going to be a people pleaser anymore. I'm going to have boundaries now, right? So naturally, when you're first aware of this kind of pattern, you're going to be faced with situations where you would typically go into your people pleasing pattern and you're going to have an opportunity to choose something else. But as this often works, we do the thing that we are intending not to do. And then afterwards, we look back and we're like, oh shit, I did the thing. I people pleased again, right? So let's say that you had the opportunity to not people please, but it came and went, you people pleased, you missed it. You didn't set the boundary again. Your other pattern, once you do that, may be to default into self-judgment and self-shaming. Ugh, I didn't set the boundary again. When am I ever going to learn? Of course I did my people-pleasing thing again. Of course I failed. I was just too uncomfortable to set the boundary. I can't do it, right? We can go into some of those stories. Instead, if you can be aware that you repeated the pattern of people pleasing and be mindful of the additional pattern to shame yourself because of it, then you will understand that you have not failed. The patterns are like our favorite old sweatshirt. They don't fit anymore. They're not helping us. They don't look good. They're full of holes, but they're really hard to part with because they were once super comfortable and familiar. So each time you're in a situation where you would normally people please, you will have the opportunity to consciously notice what you're feeling, what your old reaction or adaptive survival pattern would be, and then choose something different that is aligned with what you want. So you choose to set the boundary because that's what you actually want. Even if you feel like the shittiest person in the world afterwards, which is really common, you know that you actually aren't. So I just gave an example of what some of this work looks like within ourselves. And it's a lot, isn't it? In conscious relationships, we do our inner work. We sit with our feelings, our thoughts, our adaptive patterns, our nervous system state, and we must communicate about this with others too. That's how you bring this into a conscious relationship. Why do they have to know, right? Maybe you're asking yourself, it's not their business what I'm feeling. Why do they have to know? Because your patterns and choices affect them too. When I people please, it's not just shitty for me. It's also shitty for the person I'm people pleasing. Why? Because they're not getting the real me. They're getting a more palatable version of me, and that's actually really manipulative because they're not getting my authentic self. And anything other than my authenticity is manipulative because it's not the real me. So on some level, even something that benefits them, like people pleasing them, actually doesn't benefit the relationship, and it takes away from the trust and intimacy in the relationship. And also, it's really important to allow other people into our vulnerable inner healing world. So if we're in our hypothetical pattern of people pleasing and not setting boundaries, let's say it happens with your best friend. One way to authentically and consciously communicate would be something like this. I tend to fawn and people please. Maybe you already know this about me. I'm learning to set boundaries. So as I learn to set boundaries, I recognize that I might come across as harsh. Please know it's because I'm new at this and I'm learning. You're always welcome to share how my boundary setting lands with you. It doesn't mean that I'm going to change my boundary, but I want to be flexible with my delivery and not be rigid unless I have to be. Right? Is that revolutionary? Yes. Hard as fuck? Yes. But with a willingness to consistently practice relating in this way, what was once believed to be excruciatingly uncomfortable becomes a minor discomfort and something that you are capable of doing. If you have resistance to this, I get it. Just notice. Just notice the but in your body. Notice the objection. Notice the hesitance. Okay? Just notice it. You've never been taught to communicate this way. I wasn't taught to communicate this way. I can't remember anyone from my childhood all the way into my early 30s who I can say was a really good example of this kind of authentic, conscious relating and communicating. However, whatever stage of your life you're in and however old you are, when you learn how to communicate this way, you are honoring yourself and where you are in your process while also honoring the other person and your relationship with them. It's not blaming or shaming. There doesn't have to be yelling or passive aggressiveness. It creates openness and safety for both people. So we need to normalize self-awareness, vulnerability, honesty, and clear communication in our relationships. It's only weird because it's never been modeled to us. Or as my friend Jeffrey says, it's only weird if you're not into it. But what has been modeled to us doesn't lead to thriving relationships. So it's time to try something new, right? I've had a lot of people tell me that this way of relating comes across as therapist language, that it's sterile or cold, that it's not real. And it may throw some people off because it's not normal. That's true. But what is the alternative? right? What is the alternative? We just go back into these like inauthentic, surface level, unsafe ways of relating? No. Let's not do that. Let's start leading with vulnerability instead of leading with a trauma response. And if we can't lead with vulnerability, then let's lead with curiosity, right? When we can't lead with vulnerability, let's lead with curiosity. If we're in a trauma response, we're not leading with either. Here's some other examples, little sample scripts. Okay, these are from my book, Nourish Your Nervous System, straight from the book I'm reading. So let's say that people pleasing and allowing others to vent on you is a pattern for you. So here's something you could say. I used to overgive in relationships and let people emotionally dump on me. I thought that was how I should be a good friend. Please ask me before you dump on me or vent. I want to be there for you, but I don't always have the capacity. I'd like the chance to check in with myself. That's not blaming the other person. That's not saying, oh, you always dump on me. I never get to vent to you. It's always about you venting to me. This feels imbalanced, right? You're totally taking responsibility for yourself. You're admitting, I used to do this. I used to overgive in my relationships and let people emotionally dump on me. I recognize the belief behind it. I thought that's how I was supposed to be a good friend. Here's the boundary. Please ask me before you vent or dump. I want to be there for you, right? Acknowledgement that, yeah, I want to hold space for you, of course. Also acknowledgement, I don't always have the capacity. I'd like the chance to check in with myself. Here's another really common example. If your pattern is to experience anxiety and second guess yourself when you ask someone to do something and you need reassurance, right? Total real example for me is if I text someone and I ask them a question and they don't get back to me for a few days, I can immediately go into like, oh my gosh, what was the last thing I said to them? What was the last thing we talked about? I'll replay that entire thing in my head, trying to figure out where did I go wrong? Because it reminds me of getting the silent treatment from my mom, of like talking and asking a question and getting no response back, which causes me to go into those familiar thought patterns that, oh, this must be my fault. I must have done something wrong. There's something I need to fix. There's something I need to apologize for. Like, I don't want to relate to people that way anymore. There's so much fear and anxiety and second guessing in that. So if that is a pattern for you, then you send somebody a text, they don't get back to you right away, right? It's okay to say, I understand if you need time to think about what I've asked. If you could acknowledge that you've seen or heard my request and that you're thinking about it, that would help me feel more secure while I wait for your answer. There's so much vulnerability in that, right? Because being able to say that to someone says, I acknowledge that when you don't answer me, I feel insecure. That's a really deep, vulnerable, hard thing to acknowledge about oneself. And you're acknowledging it to another person. And you're saying, it would really help me feel more secure if you could just let me know that you've gotten my message and you're thinking about it. Right? Now, they don't have to do that. But if they're a conscious person and they're interested in creating a conscious relationship with you, then they shouldn't have a problem with doing that. One more example. If you are an anxious avoidant or disorganized attachment person, right, where you get clingy and needy and you pull, and then you get what you want and then you push them away, right? There's this push-pull. So let's say person A is the one with the disorganized attachment. Let's say person A is consciously communicating to person B. Person A says, I've noticed a pattern in my close relationships where I get clingy and needy and then I push others away. Vulnerable, intimate acknowledgement and admission of a pattern. Please let me know if you observe me doing this. I'm working on it and I don't want to hurt you or confuse you by sending mixed signals. Shows total respect for the other person in the relationship. Now, let's say person B notices person A doing the anxious avoidant thing, the push-pull thing. So then person B can say, I'm noticing that you're pulling away from me, but yesterday it seemed like you couldn't leave me alone. Is this one of those times when you're in the push-pull dynamic you told me about? I'm feeling confused. I'd like to talk about it. Now, imagine if neither of you has this awareness, neither of you has this language, and neither of you communicates this way. What happens? Person A is in their push-pull disorganized dynamic. They don't even have awareness that they're in it. It's hurting person B. They don't even have awareness of why it's hurting them because they're not familiar with disorganized attachment. So maybe they pick a fight. Maybe they get anxious and avoidant themselves. Who knows what happens? But that is going to devolve into less safety, less emotional connection, and less intimacy. And the example that I'm giving doesn't force any of that down. It actually creates space for more safety, intimacy, and connection. Now, when it comes to authentic and conscious relating, here's what I am not saying. Okay, I am not saying that every new person you meet needs a detailed explanation of your entire childhood. I am not saying that you need to wear your trauma like an identity and tell everyone about it that you meet in order to have an intimate relationship with them. I am not saying that you should talk like a therapist when you're just hanging out with your friends. I'm not saying that you have to share your entire life story with everyone before you can be in a relationship with them. I'm not saying that all of your communication has to revolve around trauma, boundaries, and attachment styles. And I'm not saying that you should judge your romantic partners and friends as problematic, harmful, or abusive just because they don't cater to your every emotional need. And yes, people do that, unfortunately. Here's what I am saying, okay? I am saying just do your thing in relationships. If and when something arises, you can use some of the cues from this episode or from the book, Nourish Your Nervous System, to help you get the conversation started with them. I'm also saying don't judge someone as unsafe if you haven't communicated clearly and explicitly what you want and need first. Unless they are obviously an unsafe person. But someone who doesn't understand your attachment style or your complex PTSD is not inherently unsafe. They just have a lack of understanding. I am saying that you may have to be the person who goes first. You might have to be the one who initiates vulnerability and open communication. This does not make you a victim. Your people don't love you any less just because vulnerability and openness are hard, but someone has to go first. Someone has to model it. Someone has to take the risk. And I am saying that other people are allowed to have feelings about what you say. Feelings are not always reflective of facts, but they do deserve space. And if you get to take up space, so do they. I want to end this episode on relational nourishment with some reflection questions. So if you journal, if you need some practical things to do to start to work on this, then here are the answers from the back of the book. So the first question, if you want to write this down, would be how could compassionate, conscious communication like this change how you navigate conflict and confrontation? Second reflection question. How would conscious communication like this foster more understanding and intimacy in your relationships? How would it feel to know in your relationships that it's not you versus them? It's you and your trauma and your attachment style and your nervous system doing your best to process difficulty while they and their trauma and their attachment and their nervous system are also doing their best. What would it be like to be in awareness of that when you're in conflict or in some sort of sticky conversation with someone? Do you think there might be less blame, less shame, less drama, less need to be right? Yeah. I want to make a suggestion. If you've never heard of nonviolent communication, please look into it. The book is called Nonviolent Communication, A Language of Compassion, written by Marshall Rosenberg, and it is excellent. And even better would be if you could find a nonviolent communication training in your local area. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode on conscious communication and relational nourishment and how you are a relational creature and you need relationships. They're not just an extra or a perk of life. They are an actual need. And it's going to take work on your part and on the other person's part to create that. But I'm evidence, many of my clients are evidence that with a lot of intentionality and consistency and time, that it is possible to create healthy, conscious, open, vulnerable, reciprocal relationships that are the containers where you get to have a lot of emotionally corrective experiences from your childhood. I know that I'm certainly having a lot of emotionally corrective experiences from my childhood in my current adult relationships. If you are interested in reading my book, Nourish Your Nervous System, you can download it as an ebook, and it also comes as an audiobook. It's over 7 hours long, the audiobook. I read the audiobook, and you can get both for less than $20 at lindseylockett.com/nourish. And make sure you stay tuned for the next episode. We're going to go even deeper into nourishing your nervous system in relationships and also nourishing your emotions. I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye. Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end of this episode. Stay in touch with me by joining my email list at lindseylockett.com/email. And feel free to follow along on Instagram at I am Lindsey Lockett. Finally, you can check out all of my offerings, including courses, private coaching, and workshops on my website at lindseylockett.com.